Welcome to my little tutorial here on some of the basics of Photoshop, as you may need to use them for our class. I should say off the bat, I'm using Adobe Photoshop Creative Cloud 2017, which is what the computers at the College of St. Elizabeth have installed. If you have another version of Photoshop, it should function pretty similarly, so you should be able to follow along. And if you're using an entirely different image editor than Photoshop, you can probably ignore most of this, but some of this might be useful for you in terms of general tricks and principles. Now, right off the bat, the Associated Press has a few guidelines on what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do in terms of retouching and editing photos. According to the Associated Press, you are allowed to do minor retouching to eliminate dust on cameras or other minor adjustments, including cropping, dodging, burning, conversion to grayscale, normal, tonal, and color adjustments, things that aid in clear and accurate reproduction of an image. What you want to avoid, what's not allowed, is changes in density or contrast or saturation that substantially alter the image. Backgrounds should not be digitally blurred out or removed. Red eye must not be digitally removed. Essentially, you want to make sure that you're maintaining the integrity of the image from a journalistic standpoint. You're not altering it beyond what's necessary to just make it a more easily consumable image. If you ever get an image that's handed to you and you use it in your article, but it has been altered or manipulated by someone else, then you have to make a note of that in the caption, according to AP style. All right, so now let's get into how you might actually do some of this stuff. First, this is Photoshop. If you're unfamiliar, I'll give you a quick overview of what you're looking at. Up here, you have all of the menus. This is where you'll find the majority of the functions you're able to perform, although there are other faster ways, shortcuts to most of these throughout as well. On the left here, you'll see the toolbar, and this is where you're going to select what tools you're using in order to manipulate the image with the mouse. And on the right, you'll see a bunch of panels that are sort of customizable. You can drag and drop these panels, and you can select which ones are forwards and which ones are backwards. What I generally like to have is the history panel here, because this will show you every step that you do. So you can actually go back in time if you make a mistake. It's like the super Control-Z button. It's the super undo. You can go back all the way to the beginning of your image when you first opened it. Or you can jump forward if turns out you liked an edit that you made. And down here, I usually have layers open because you can create various layers, which is almost like transparent superimpositions of various layers of edits that you can do. So what we're basically going to be doing is using one of these tools to do stuff to this image here. These will be our controls to see what we've done and how we're doing it. And up here is the final bar that might be useful to you, which gives you specific details and customizable information about the tool you have selected. All right. So the first thing you might want to do when you open an image, such as this less than glorious image of the College of St. Elizabeth's campus, is you might want to crop it. Perhaps what you took isn't the right aspect ratio, or it just isn't angled the correct way. There's a few ways to do that. The simplest way is with the crop tool. So you're going to go down here to this tool that actually looks like a crop and click it. And this gives you the real simple drag and drop. This is my new frame, my new aspect ratio. If you want it to stay the same aspect ratio, you can hold down the Shift button and it will scale proportionately. So say that's my new image. I'm going to hit Enter, and there we go. Now it's cropped. Now again, if you decide you don't like this, you can go right back here and go back in time or forward in time. So this is when I first opened it, and this is the crop I just made. If you want to have a little bit more correction here, a little bit more control over your correction here, you can actually go to a filter here called Lens Correction. And this gives you a little bit more possibilities. For example, if you want this horizon to be a little bit more horizontal, so to speak, you can just simply choose this straighten tool, which is chosen by default, and just drag a line across what you want to be horizontal. And it will make that now horizontal. Of course, this is on a hill, so now these trees look out of whack. So maybe you want these trees to be vertical instead. You can just drag a line of what you want to be vertical, and it will make that vertical. And with this, you can kind of get some tweaking to something that looks horizontal enough or vertical enough to be a comfortable image. All right, let's just say that this is what we want. This is where we want it. You can also change any distortion that might have happened when you took the photo. For example, if it was fisheyed at the edges and warped outward, you can use this tool to slide left or right to seriously disfigure the image, or if you use it sensitively, you can remove some distortion and return it to normal. So if your image is ballooning out, you can make it flatten back to normal. You can also, if there's fringe, meaning there's color that's a little off-centered, there's a little red to the right and not to the left, you can shift where these colors line up so that you can have the colors in alignment. If the edges are darker, they call that a vignette. If the edges are darker or lighter than they should be, you can change. You'll see as I lessen the amount here, the edges around the perimeter get darker or they get lighter. So if you have experienced that issue with your lens, that's the way to correct it. The other really, really useful tool here is the perspective tool, which means if your whole image is skewed to the left or to the right, keystoned, so to speak, you can fix that keystoning by dragging, and this essentially tilts the image towards us or away from us, or in this case, to the left or to the right. This is really, really useful when you're photographing something flat and square, and it's very obvious that it's not square from the perspective that you took it. For example, if you're photographing artwork or something like that. And you can zoom by increasing the scale. All right, say you've got that all to your liking. Oops, we will set that back at 100 here. We'll hit OK, and it applies that. Now, if you want to get really particular about your cropping and perhaps your image is askew, let's say we were taking a photograph of a painting and this rectangle were that painting. Maybe this rectangle is just so askew that no amount of keystone correction can get it to line up. Well, if you click and hold on any of these tools that have this little arrow here, clicking and holding gives you a drop-down menu of different versions of that tool. So here we have the crop tool by default, but you can actually use the perspective crop tool to then refine. So maybe I will pretend that this is my painting that I'm taking a photograph of, and I want this to be square. I'm going to zoom in just so you can see. If you use, if you're on a Mac, it would be Command plus. If you're on PC, it would be Control plus. Control plus zooms in, Control minus zooms out. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit here and just move over so you can see. Now, with this perspective tool, I can actually drag the corners and line them up with the corners of this image. So if something is very askew, we can match up these corners, and now when I hit enter, it will drag those corners out to square, thus correcting a skewed image. And we'll go back over here. So you can do this as extremely or as subtly as you need to. We'll zoom out again here. That should take care of your cropping. So here, let me just crop in a little bit just for the sake of it. I'm going to crop in like that. I don't actually need it to be any different perspective, so we'll just leave it at that. I'll hit enter, and now that's our photo. Not really the best crop, but it'll do for us. The next thing you might want to do is resize your image. This is where if you need to submit a certain amount of pixels or a certain file size, you want it to be a certain size on a web page, this is how you would do that. And you go up to the image menu here, and you have two options, image size and canvas size. We'll look at canvas size first. No, we'll look at image size first. If you go to image size, you'll see some options here. You can do inches or change the size by a certain percent or the amount of pixels, centimeters, millimeters, etc. Inches is fine. Points or pixels is usually a good reference point. The things you want to pay attention to are the width, height, and resolution. Now, for most online production, 72 pixels per inch, 72 dpi as it's sometimes called, is the standard. If it starts to be less than that, you're going to see it fall apart and get pixelated. If it starts to be more than that, you're probably dealing with more information than you need to get a seamless image on the size of the computer screen you're going to be looking at it on. So 72 dpi, 72 pixels per inch ppi is fine. And then you can resize this to whatever width or height you need in order to fit your page. Now, if you wanted this to be printed instead of posted online, 300 is the number you want to shoot for. 300 pixels per inch will print without falling apart and becoming pixelated. And then maybe because I'm printing it, I want to fit it onto a page, so I'm going to set this for the width. Maybe I'll set the width for 7 inches so that it fits to an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. So this is going to print this in portrait orientation on a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, theoretically, 7 inches wide, and every inch is going to contain 300 pixels. I'm going to hit OK, and it resizes this accordingly. Now the other option, canvas size, gives you how big this space around your image is. The canvas is the total space that you're working on. So this image could take up less than the whole canvas if you wanted to. You could expand the canvas, say, from the dimensions of the image to, I don't know, 10 inches wide. And then we might want it to expand evenly out from the center, or we might want it to expand out to the right and down to the bottom. Let's just do that so that you can see the difference. And I'll hit OK. Let's see, and we'll make this, say, 9 inches. Now you can see the canvas has extended to 10 inches by 9 inches out from that reference point in the corner we picked. All right, we're going to go back to our image here. I'll zoom in a little bit with Control plus. Oop, too far, Control minus. Now, once you've got an image that's the proper size for what you want to do, and I should note, you probably want to crop before you resize, because if you resize first, as soon as you crop later, you're going to end up with a different size than what you just resized to, and you'll have to redo that. So crop first, resize second. Now, the next thing you might want to do is change the brightness or the contrast. That's a standard edit that most people will make because phone photographs or high-quality DSLR photographs alike will often not treat the white balance of the room exactly the way you want to. So you might need to do some post-production editing. Now, there are a few ways to do that. Again, you have the simplest way, which is just a brightness and contrast slider. So you can go up into the menu here, and on the image, now I should say there are auto tone, auto contrast, auto color. If you click that, okay, it fixes the contrast a little bit, fix the tone a little bit, fix the color a little bit. The thing is, this tends to get wildly out of hand because it doesn't know what your goal is. So this just made this all a little bit more orange than I would like. I tend to find that the auto tone, auto contrast, auto color doesn't really help much. So instead, I'm going to go to adjustments. And with adjustments, the first one is brightness contrast. And this gives you a simple slider. And move that up, it makes it brighter. Move that up, it makes the darks darker and the lights lighter. You can desaturate it or make it darker the same way. Decontrast it. So maybe I want to add a little brightness, take away a little bit of contrast, so we bring out the midtones a little bit more. All right, perfect. Now it's a little bit better. Now the difference here is this is a destructive edit, meaning once you've done it, you can't you can't separate that edit from the image underneath it. So you're stuck with it from here going forward, unless you just completely undo and go back. There's a non-destructive way to do this by, instead of going to image adjustments, you're going to go down here to this little icon over here is a layer, a filter. And you're going to do a filter mask of brightness contrast. This puts a mask on top of this, which can be turned on or off, and it gives you the same slider. So make it brighter, increase the contrast, whatever you need to do. Now, the good thing about this, I'll hide that here. The good thing about this is this can be turned on or off at will without affecting the original image. Now, if you want a little bit more control than just brightness or contrast, you might want to go with what's called levels. And again, you can go to Image, Adjustments, Levels, or you can go right here to a mask. So I'm going to go to the mask, Image, Levels, right here. And this gives you a histogram that shows how much of the darkest darks are present in your photo and how much of the lightest lights. And you can see most of the photo is pretty blown out. There's a lot of really, really bright. So you maybe want to bring that in a little bit so that this is going to set where the brightest point is and where the darkest point is. This is going to set where the midtone is. So this sets the middle range is now darker than it should be, which has the effect of lightening everything else, or a little bit brighter than it should be, which has the effect of darkening. The middle is now brighter, so now everything below it is darker. So we're going to bring this in, or do whatever you need to do in order to achieve the effect that you want to achieve. And again, you can toggle this on and off. All right, so maybe I'm getting a slightly more sensible picture here. Now, if you want even more control than that, you can go to a curves layer. So this, again, Image, Adjustments, Curves, or you can go right in here and make a curves mask. And this gives you the most control. I'll hide these so that we get an accurate representation of the original image. And again, you have the histogram, but now in addition to these sliders, you also have control over the levels of any point by clicking and dragging. So we're bringing maybe, oh, I turned that off. That's why you can't see it. You can drag any point of this histogram up or down. So want less midtones? Now we have less midtones. Want less highlights? Now we have less highlights. Want more of the darkest darks? Now you've got more of those darkest darks becoming brighter. So if you want to do a simple contrast, by the way, if you just slide these off, it gets rid of them. So if you want to do a simple contrast, usually what you're going to do is bring the brights up, the darks down, and now you've made the darkers darker and the lighters lighter. And you can do whatever works best for your image in order to try and achieve something that makes sense. Now, if you need to do some spot lightening or darkening, say if this area was burnt out, really just too dark, but the rest of the image is fine. Over here on the left, you'll see there's a dodging and burning tool. Dodge and burn. And these are darkroom photography terms for essentially allowing more light or less light to enter into the development process, more of the development agent or less. So you're going to be able to adjust the size of your tool here. I have it pretty huge, but you can make it smaller. Make it bigger. And the hardness, whether it's a really stark contrast or whether it's gradual. And then what I'm going to do is just click, and as I click, let me turn the hardness up a little bit. We'll turn the size up a little bit. Oh, And this brings me to a good point. Right now, I have the curves layer selected, which means I am dodging and burning my curves layer. What I want to be dodging and burning is my actual photo. That's why you saw no change. So now, as I click, I am darkening this corner. And if I want to lighten it instead, I just go to the dodge tool, and I can lighten that corner. Obviously, I'm doing it way too extremely, and so I'm going to blow out the image. But you can do it subtly in appropriate situations to really help enhance your image. All right, so now let me scroll back up through my dodges and burns, and I can go back in time to any point. So this should give you pretty good control over the lights and darks in your image, make it not so washed out or not so dark. So the next thing you might want to do is you might want to adjust the colors. Maybe it's way too orange, way too blue, way too whatever random color it decides to be. And so we're going to select our image again, go to Image, Adjustments, and now we're going to look at hue, saturation, color balance, all of these options. So now again, you could go the easy way, auto color, auto contrast, but that usually doesn't work out. The adjustments here, you want to try, the easiest one is the color balance. The color balance, of course, you can also find a layer for down here. Color balance. Hue saturation I find is not that useful. This is the hue saturation tool, and it changes the entire sort of center point of all of the colors. So instead of being neutrally colored, now the entire thing is skewed to this color. And you can make some really funky images this way, but in practical terms, it doesn't really do much that's I've found useful. So we're going to get rid of that. And instead, I want to show you color balance. And color balance gives you sliders where you can actually adjust how much of the primary colors are mixed in. So if you need it redder, you just tilt it a little bit to the red. Maybe you want to balance that with some green, balance that with some yellow, get a really yellowy image here. You could get it bluer. So if you have an image that's too warm or too cool, you can easily make up for that. Here I've slanted it a little bit towards being a cooler image. If you go more towards the reds and towards the yellows, you can get a warmer image, and you can really do some good adjustments that way. If you need to go back and adjust any of these, all you have to do is double click on it, and it brings it right back up. You can also adjust whether you're changing the midtones or the highlights or the shadows. So if I want the darker parts of the image to be skewed towards a certain color, I can adjust that and make the shadows very red. But maybe the highlights I want very blue. So now we've got red dark parts and blue light parts. You can play with that to your heart's content. Now, if you want more control, similar to the brightness and contrast, you can also go to a histogram model. And this is where the curves actually has some really interesting possibilities. So we're going to add another curves layer. Right now we have this to RGB. RGB stands for red, green, blue, which are the primary colors of light. That's because pixels are outputting light, so RGB makes the most sense for these color blends. If you need to change the color model that you're using, you can go to mode, image, mode, and instead of RGB, red, green, blue, primary colors of light, you could do CMYK, which is cyan, magenta, yellow, and then K is for black. I'm not really sure why. That is the primary colors of pigment, of ink. So if you're printing, you might want to set it in this so that you can make sure you have printer-friendly colors. There's all these other types, lab color, which has more to do with luminescence and saturation, all of these different variations of how to construct colors. We're going to leave it in RGB right now. So right now, RGB means we're adjusting all of the colors at once. And remember, if you blend all the colors of light together in even amounts, you get white light. And if you get rid of all those colors, you'd get black because there's no light. But if you want, you can separate these. So maybe the red, you want more reds in the dark, but less reds in the lightest parts. And then maybe the green, you want a little bit more green in the midtone, but not so much in the brightest parts and not so much in the darkest parts. And then maybe in the blue, you want a little bit more kind of a general blue in the middle, but not so much in the darkest parts. Or maybe you want a lot in the darkest parts. And so you can actually construct your image layer by layer here, color by color. And when you get back to the RGB, you'll see a different plot pointed for every single color that you used, each color separation. Now, the next thing you might want to do is if you realize that, oh, there's something in there should not be, it's a speck of dust, it's a piece of lint, something got on the film, you can actually heal and get rid of these things. There's a few ways to do this. You can use the cloning tool, which if you use this stamp here, you've got the clone stamp tool or the pattern stamp tool. Clone stamp is what you're going to want to use here. Clone stamp gives you a cursor that looks like this that you can adjust in size and hardness. Maybe we'll make it a little bit smaller. Yeah, that's about fine. And the trick here is if you hold down the Alt button, I believe it's Alt on Mac and Control on PC, you will get a different cursor. This is going to set your reference point. And now anything that I have just clicked on that reference point is going to be mapped onto wherever I click next. Oop, I'm sorry. Alt click. I was looking at the wrong button. Alt gives you the reference point. And so anything that shows up here will now get superimposed over to here. So if I want grass in the trees, I can just paint grass on the trees, and you can see the reference point moving along. And if I keep going up, it's going to start overwriting. And you can see I'm actually cloning, hence the name, the image. This is really good if I wanted to get rid of, say, I don't know, this chunk of snow. I could select a reference point from a clear patch of grass and then go over and paint that patch of grass over the snow, and voila, it is gone. In the occasion that you have, in the event that you have a patch like this, that might be a little bit harder to source places around in order to get a reference point. That's when you might want to use this spot healing tool. So spot healing brush tool is what you want, and it's going to give you a similar looking thing, although it's going to do all the heavy leg work for you. All you have to do is click it, and it's going to smartly try and figure out what is around it and cover over that spot with stuff that matches. So if we want to get rid of those, bingo. Sometimes it does a little messier job because it doesn't know exactly what you want to reference. You might have to do it a few times to make it look natural, or you might need to refine the size or hardness. So I can get rid of a lot of snow pretty quickly this way. You can also maybe get rid of a car. And if this horizon doesn't work out for you, you can always switch back over to your clone stamp tool, define a reference point on the horizon, and then move it over here and paint it in. And with a subtler, a little bit more care, a little bit careful touch, you can really get a seamless image. Now remember, for Associated Press guidelines, we don't want to do too much photo manipulation in this regard, but it is good for getting rid of specks of dust or incidental things that are actually hindering the clarity of the image. This should give you a pretty good example of anything that you need to do for journalistic purposes. If you, for whatever reason, needed to superimpose text, you can drag a text box using this tool. If you needed to select something, you can use that tool up there to make a selection. You can also select elliptical marquees so that maybe if I only want my mask to apply to that one area, put a curves mask here, and now you can see down in this corner, the mask applies only to that circle. And when I do weird things, it shows up only in that circle. And again, you can turn on or off any of these effects that you created as layers with masks. And you can also drag them so that they appear above or below any of the others. Think of it as like working on a light box. Anything that is on top is going to show through the most. Anything that's on bottom is going to get covered over. And each layer has a certain amount of opacity or transparency that you can toggle in order to see through to the layers beneath it. That should give you everything you need. So now the last point here is exporting. Once you have an image that you're happy with, we'll pretend this is an image I'm happy with, we will go up to File, and you have two options, Save or Save As. If you do Save, this will save a Photoshop file, PSD file. And that means that if you were to send this to someone, they would have to open it using Photoshop, and they would see exactly what you're seeing with all of the behind-the-scenes editing paraphernalia. So if you want this to be an image someone can open or an image you can upload to a website, what you're going to want to do is Save As. And then you're going to use the drop-down to change it from Photoshop to one of the image formats. And there are a few, there's obviously a ton of different image formats, but there are a few to take note of. The first is there's a difference between a raw photo and a compressed photo. Raw photos contain all of the information that is stored in this image, pixel for pixel, with nothing lacking. They tend to be huge files. But Photoshop RAW is a good way to keep masters of all of your best images. The next best thing is a TIF, because that will basically be lossless, but it's not as large and expansive. It doesn't contain all of the metadata of a raw file. So it's lossless in that it does not lose, it doesn't compress any information. So a TIFF is going to be a relatively large file size, but it's going to contain everything that this image contains will be preserved, visually speaking. In terms of lossy, they call it lossy because you lose some quality during the compression process, but in terms of lossy file types, the three you want to pay attention to are going to be JPEG, PNG, or I guess perhaps PDF you might use sometimes, but JPEG, PNG, or you could get, or BMP, I suppose, is another one. Really, the two that you want to pay attention to are JPEG and PNG. JPEGs are by far the standard. They will give you the best bang for your buck as far as quality for file size. And that's the standard for if you're going to send somebody a photo. PNG, the only difference between PNG and JPEG, PNG is slightly lower quality, though not usually discernibly so. However, it retains the layer of information that contains opacity. So that means if I were to cut a hole in this picture so that it would be see-through to the background and there is nothing here, a JPEG would flatten that out and you'd end up with a picture that shows up as white here. PNG would retain that opacity and it would show up as nothing here, which means you could superimpose it on any background and you would see through to that background. This is really good to know if you're making, say, a logo. If you make a logo and your logo is exported as a JPEG, you're going to end up with your logo inside a white box. But if you export it as a PNG, that empty background around your logo will stay an empty background. And then you could put your logo onto anything that you want with that background not showing through as a white box. So for our purposes, we're going to export this as a JPEG. And then you're going to choose where you want it to go and hit save. I'll put it on my desktop just so I don't lose it. And you're going to get some quality options. Obviously, the lower the quality, the lower the file size, the higher the quality, the higher the file size. Usually 10 is a pretty good option. If you really want good quality, don't be afraid to turn it up. You're just going to get a bigger file size. And this is how it processes all of the pixel information. Usually you don't even have to worry about toggling this. Baseline standard is totally fine. I'm going to hit OK. And now if we go to our desktop, if we can get to our desktop, minimize, please. You should see here is the image that we could send to someone or upload. This has been your Photoshop tutorial. I hope it has been useful to you.